The ability to read and write is of critical importance, not only for individuals to effectively participate in daily living, but also to ensure global competitiveness of the workforce. In our rich fabric of multiculturalism in Canada, where more than 200 different languages are spoken in addition to English and French, providing effective education to support and increase literacy levels becomes a unique and complex endeavor. While the BC government has announced its aim to make the province the most literate jurisdiction on the continent and overall, the importance of literacy is non-debatable. The approach to addressing and enhancing literacy, however, appears to be. Does a literacy crisis actually exist? Are we on track for enhancing literacy? What should or can be done to ensure a literate population? I'm Paul Shaker, and this is An Education Matter. Our guests today are Victoria Purcell-Gates, Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Early Childhood Literacy, UBC, and Tracy Gates, Teacher, John Henderson Annex Elementary School, Vancouver School Board. Welcome, Vicki and Tracy.
Thank you.
I thought we'd start by having Vicki give us a little background on how she came to this point of being a Canada Research Chair in Literacy at UBC. A little review of your career so the audience can understand what goes into creation of an authority on this field.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. I got my degree at the University of California at Berkeley in 1986, and I first went to the University of Cincinnati, and it was there that I got into studying literacy within a cultural context. And my first book came out of that study. It's called Other People's Words, The Cycle of Low Literacy. And I started to think about how the cultures influence the way people see and think about literacy with that study of urban Appalachians. Then I moved from there to Harvard University, and as at Cincinnati, I was directing a clinic at the university where I was teaching teachers to work with students who are having problems with reading and writing. And so that continued at Harvard. I took over the Harvard, it's called the Reading Lab, and I changed the name to Literacy Lab. And I was at Harvard for 8 years. And during that time, I started studying adult literacy also, because in terms of thinking about how children learn to read and write, I was coming to understand the real importance of how they were seeing literacy, how people around them were reading and writing, and how that influenced the children's success in school. So when you think about low literate parents, I was very concerned about that. So I did a study on adult literacy there that was across the entire United States, and it ended up in my evolving interest that I think we're going to talk about later today in what we've been calling authentic literacy instruction, or real-life literacy activity. I went from Harvard to Michigan State University. I was there 5 years as a full professor and continuing in my work there with these studies around literacy as it occurs outside of school, different communities' uses of literacy. I expanded my interest around the world where we were trying to collect case studies of different cultural communities using literacy. So we had studies from Africa and Cuba and Latin America and across the United States, immigrants in the US from China, and so on. I was at Michigan State University when John Shapiro, our assistant dean, who has been a friend of mine for a while, emailed me, and they had been asking me for quite a while now to consider their Canada Research Chair position in early literacy. And I was perfectly happy where I was. However, John, knowing me, called me the day after the invasion of Iraq by the US and said, "How about now? Why not come to Canada, a kinder, gentler place?" So I said, okay, we'll talk about that. So I came up, I saw, I interviewed with people at the university, And then for Canada Research Chair, the application is quite involved. You have to plan a research agenda for 7 years. That agenda has to be approved highly by people in both in Canada, but it's international in scope. So it takes about a year for all of those pieces to fall into place. And then so I arrived here in 2004. And so I've been here almost 5 years.
Well, I hope this doesn't mean with the change in politics in America that you're going to go back.
My students ask me that. And no, it doesn't. I just got my permanent residency.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now, some people would see all this addition of culture studies as being an unnecessary complication of the task of literacy. You know, I mean, some people would say, well, you know, you get the children in the classroom, you put the workbooks in front of them, you put the letters on the wall, and we take it from there. Why is it that to do your job at the highest level, you need to draw such a wide circle around the student in understanding their capacity for literacy?
Well, first of all, that approach of just putting the students in a chair and putting letters and words on the wall hasn't worked for a significant number of people. And if you look at who it hasn't worked for, around the world, in Canada, US, and any other country where they're trying to teach children to read, it's the marginalized groups. It's those who have the least amount of economic power, political power, social status, and so on. So in the Canadian context, you can think about the Aboriginal community right off. You can think about that. But then we also know that different language groups are not succeeding in Canada. We have test data for that. Lee Gunderson, who's a professor at UBC in literacy, just finished a very large study of the students in the Vancouver School District, I think it was, and found that a significant number of children who were speaking a language other than English here in BC were failing to succeed in school, were failing to graduate. So you can look at any context and you'll see that. So there has to be something about culture, status, language, and where these people are living in terms of who the schools are built for, who has control of the schools, and so on. That is important in terms of why they're not learning. And I've always had the position that if children aren't learning, it's because we're not teaching them. And so that's why that was the first thought, that you have to get beyond just the classroom, because that classroom, if it's just structured that way, sort of without culture, without outside influences, as if it's for every single student, was only working for the privileged and not for the unprivileged.
I don't know if you've noticed this, but for me, coming to Canada, there's been a big difference in the way people relate to that issue in education of the contextual factors outside of school that affect learning. In Canada, the tendency is for people to say, well, of course, if the child's living under difficult circumstances at home, they would have more difficulty in school. Whereas in the United States, any number of times I was told it doesn't make any difference. You have them in school from 8:30 to 2:30, and you should be able to work with any child just the same. So I take it that your career is centered around the notion that it does make a difference, the entire context.
It makes a difference, and it makes a difference for every child. So if you look at, for example, some of the instructional strategies that are very commonly used to teach young children to read, that are centered around reading storybooks and that type of thing, that is bringing the outside world of the child who at home has read a lot of storybooks into the classroom. We just think it's just normal because it's normal to us. But in fact, to think that every child is the same is a recipe for disaster as far as instructional outcome.
Of course, another thing is the child from a privileged background might be privileged in becoming literate, but they may have other deficiencies in their upbringing, like the physical culture and their health and well-being through exercise and so on, that the school can compensate for once those are identified.
Yes, yeah.
Now, at the center of your current work, I understand, is the concept of real-life literacy. So it follows that we need for you to explain to us
Right.
real life literacy and how that connects to your studies of the broader culture that children emerge from.
Okay, good. So we have been calling this authentic literacy instruction, and I think if teachers are watching this, I think that they may have heard of that, authentic literacy instruction. But however, it's defined in a particular way that's a little different from the way it used to be defined when people were really focused on what was called whole language instruction. So this plan for instruction comes out of several very large research studies that show that people that at any age, from young kids up through adult learners, learn better and faster if they're engaged in this. What is it? It is bringing in, especially for the beginning readers, it's bringing into the classroom to use for literacy instruction the texts that they're familiar with from their homes and from their communities. So, for example, the storybooks are familiar to some kids, but to some kids they're not familiar, but they have other things that they're familiar with, like check writing or recipes or newspapers or flyers that advertise rock concerts. Once you get into studying this, you just start to see text all over you. And so it involves a teacher learning about what's involved. What are the literacy worlds like for the teacher students? What does it look like for them? Why are people reading? Who's reading? And what are they reading? When are they reading? Just sort of get a feel for their world. And then think about bringing that into the activity in the classroom that sits alongside a very sequenced and explicit skill instruction. It's either embedded in that or it's alongside. There's any number of ways that can sit with this type of authentic or real-life literacy. What it is engaging the kids then in reading or writing those real-life texts that they're familiar with for the same reasons that they know people read and write them. So, for example, if they know that when somebody in their home might be making brownies, okay, that they use the recipes or the directions on the back of the box. So in the classroom, that would become totally, and we have a rating scale as to how highly authentic, somewhat, and so on. That would be totally authentic or real life if the teacher has set up a situation that calls for the making of brownies, and it involves the kids too. They're into this. Maybe they're going to have a party, or they're going to share something with the kindergartners, or whatever. And they have arranged with the cafeteria that they're going to make brownies. And the teacher then starts involving them in reading these package instructions. She may even write out some simplified ones depending on the level of the kids. And then they follow them, read them, follow them, make the brownies, deliver the brownies, or eat the brownies, whichever they want to do. That is the type of activity that we're talking about. So it involves a real-life text, a real-life purpose for reading and writing those texts, and that has to come out of a context of activity that reading and writing those texts would make sense in.
When we come back, we'll see how these ideas relate to a real-life classroom here in Vancouver School Board.
For more than 40 years, the Faculty of Education at SFU has been delivering academic programs that are innovative and responsive. Based on the academic research of our professors and the expertise of practicing teachers from your communities, our programs are designed to meet classroom needs. As a community, we're piecing together a successful education experience for students today and in the future.
Back now with Victoria Purcell Gates and Tracy Gates. Tracy, now you're a classroom teacher and also you have studied at the graduate level with Vicki. And as I understand it, you have taken a number of these ideas, plus the results of your other study, and applied them in your classroom in Vancouver School Board.
Yes.
So we'd like to hear what this looks like in a classroom. Would you please give us an overall description?
Sure. I teach on the east side of Vancouver in a community that's very multicultural. I would say most of my students come from an immigrant background and have English as their second language. We have a variety of special needs students that are designated. I teach in a bit of an unusual situation because I teach a 3-4-5 split. So there's 3 grades in one classroom. And I have a partner teacher. So I teach with someone else full-time. So there's 2 teachers in the classroom all the time, and also a third teacher who also is in there 50% of the time. So it really lowers the student-teacher ratio. So we have 3 grade levels, but there's a lot of support. And because there's extra adults in the room, it allows us to try and do some more of these authentic literacy activities. Not that you need to have that, but some of the ones that we've chosen to do are large projects. So an example of one of the things we started doing was producing a talk show, somewhat like this, sort of based on a Regis and Kelly sort of format, where there is, the children produce a script, so they've been taught how to write scripts, the format, the punctuation, and the reason and for the script. They are given a theme. They have to develop a script based on the theme. Once a week we have a production crew that goes and films the script with the children. It's edited. And then every week that becomes our opening segment for our show, is the children's production. Also within that show, there's a game show element. We play Jeopardy, or we play Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, or $10,000 Pyramid, and it's all questions that are based on our curriculum. So it's a review, but it's in a game format. And the children come up with the questions, and they run the computers and everything. They've all been trained. As well, there are guest speakers that come in on our show. So they write letters to invite the people to come in. They research their jobs. We talk about it. They have to come up with questions. And then at the end, they have to write thank you notes to each of the guests. So inherent in just that one project that we do, there's a multitude of literacy tasks that they had to be taught, where they're using real-life text, and there's a real-life purpose because they are producing something, and they have to learn it, and they're motivated by it. So that's one example. We also taught them, and it can be something as simple as letter writing. In social studies, we were studying government. So they were taught about the different levels of government, and then they chose one that they were interested in learning more about, and they had to write a letter to that government service requesting more information. And almost all of them got replies from the service, and some of them got giant boxes full of DVDs from, the Canadian Space Agency. So, I mean, they were very motivated, especially when they saw other children getting responses. So they were taught how to write the letter in a proper format. They had to edit it so it was perfect to go out. They had to learn how to address an envelope. They sent it off, and then when they got the letter back, then they were highly motivated to read it. And even though some of the language was very complicated, they were receiving back from, let's say, the tax revenue. One child got a letter back from, Revenue Canada, and complicated language, but this child was extremely motivated to understand this letter that had been sent to them.
As a student of history of education, I'm impressed at the way the origins of education, which was for an elite, a very limited number of people thousands of years ago to preserve the heritage of a society, those traditions have carried on all the way to the present day, where until we began to take dramatic measures, we were writing off so many young people. And what you and Vicki are describing to me is a way to make a commitment to schools in a democratic society where we don't keep education and literacy as elite, and we don't write off, 50, 60, 80% of people from really achieving the literacy levels they need. I think when people ask why do all of this, it always needed to be done, but in the past we just looked away from the children that our schools didn't serve, and now we're trying to attend to them. That's what I hear coming through this discussion.
Well, and certainly in a multicultural context like Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, there's not really another option. These are the children I have in my class. 99% of them come from an ESL background and from their parents themselves, or their parents are from a different country. And this is how I teach, and this is how I must teach if I'm going to reach them. And going around for a study, I went around and I went into people's homes in my community and interviewed them about what they read and wrote on a regular basis. And it was at that point, as a teacher, where I really discovered a rapport with the families, that these weren't people that didn't care about their children. These weren't people that just because they didn't show up for the parent-teacher conference that they weren't supportive. These were people that were very dedicated to their children and their learning and very supportive. They just weren't perhaps able to support their children in the way we traditionally think a middle-class Canadian family might be supportive. They were working very hard. They didn't have the English capacity to help their children in that way, but there was lots of literacy going on in their homes, just not what we would traditionally think of as literacy. And so I took that information and I try to bring it into myself and my partner teacher, try to bring it in as much as we can. Every time we plan something, we go, is this authentic? And if there's a way we can make it authentic, we do. And, you know, to be practical, not everything can be. There are simply some things that you must just teach them, and you're learning this because you must learn this, and it's important. But we do try, for the most part, to engage the students and to call on what is important to them in their lives and what makes a connection for them in their real life.
Before I ask Vicki to comment from her point of view on what's going on in your application of real-life literacy, I wondered if you'd tell us a little more about the multi-grade aspect, because that's a very powerful dimension to this that I wouldn't like to be overlooked by our audience.
Well, like I said before, I teach a 3-4-5, which when I tell most people, especially other teachers, they're horrified that they think that I've been forced into this position, but it was actually a choice. I work at a school that happens to have an open area, so there's a gigantic space that sort of allows us to have 45 students in one room. And we originally decided to try what's sort of this multi-age grouping philosophy, because if you're in a classroom today, you know that if you have a single class of grade 3s or 4s or whatever regular class you have a wide range of abilities, especially in literacy. I might have a child, and this happens every year, that comes in the middle of the year, speaks not a word of English, doesn't even know how to say hello. And yet, on the other end of the spectrum, I may have a grade 3 child who's reading a grade 7 novel. As the only single teacher in that room, to try and meet that range, it's very difficult. So my partner and I decided that we were going to combine our classes together. I had a 3-4, he had a 4-5, because we thought, well, we have this range anyways, and we're struggling with it on our own. If we combine our resources, if we combine our manpower, our teaching abilities, our strengths and our weaknesses, and also our resource support, we can actually reduce the student-teacher ratio in that scenario. Instead of 25-1, often there's 3 teachers in our room, and we divide the children up into groups to try and meet their ability. And therefore, the teacher-student ratio becomes 15-1. And it's some organizational challenges, and there are all sorts of other things you have to consider. But it also, not only academically do I think that it serves their needs better by being able to group them according to what they need as opposed to what their age is, but also in terms of social responsibility. We have the older kids in grade 5 that are helping the grade 3s. They all sit together a lot of the time, and it really has reduced bullying and issues like that because they all know each other, and you're much more less likely to intimidate a child who you spend all day with in the classroom because you know that child. Yeah. And so they become friends.
There's so many wonderful dimensions to this. The fact that the teachers and the parents and the children all know each other for 3 years.
Yes.
And the fact that the child who is a little behind in one thing has more of a chance to catch up. Mm-hmm. And the fact that there's a natural venue for cooperative learning, and children who get something, whether they're younger or older, can help with the children who don't get it. There's so many advantages that it makes you wonder why we've had to reconstruct this. This is the way schools were if you go back 100 to 150 years, and now we're trying to reinstill the best aspects of it as we have at Charles Dickens School, and, for example, in Vancouver School Board. Well, Vicki, I suppose hearing that description of the classroom would lead you to be able to amplify some of what you've heard and reconnect it back to the theories and research that you're doing.
Yes, for sure. I love this school. I worked with all of the teachers last year quite a bit, and Tracy has just taken it and gone like that with it. Clearly, what these teachers have managed to do is to not view parents of minority students, these are minority language and ethnic students, as problems, but to view them as resources and as strengths. So, as Tracy said, they got out, they got to know their community. We no longer live in the communities we teach in as much as they used to. So that's such a major shift when you're not blaming the parents for the kids' success, but you're actually learning from the parents ways to help their children learn in school. This multi-grade notion, I don't know if this would be that operative or not, but it seems to me that, and I've seen this with Mexican immigrants in the U.S., that the children, when they're at home, are multi-age, and they work together, right? And so to artificially separate them off into age groups sometimes hurts more than it helps. And in this way, with the multi-age or multi-grade grouping, these kids now are sort of working in ways that they're familiar and around tasks that they understand and that they want to engage in. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tracy. We'll be back in a moment. Literacy is a school-related topic that commands special interest and emotion on the part of parents as well as educators. The debate over how to teach reading has become intertwined with attitudes about child rearing and even religion. Within the professional education community, no field attracts brighter or more motivated researchers and scholars. Their work continues to substantially advance and broaden discussions of literacy and merits the attention of persons truly open to understanding the field. Literacy for democratic citizenship, they argue, must be attended by a critical, activist attitude in order for us to fulfill our potential as a society. Such literacy is at the heart of a truly liberal education and vital for democracy to succeed. Meanwhile, read to your children and grandchildren. Thank you for watching Your Education Matters.
For more information about this show or to view past episodes, go to the Your Education Matters website at www.youreducationmatters.ca. The views and opinions presented in this program are not necessarily those of all faculties, staff, or administration at SFU.